Hello and welcome to EURACTIV's Agrifood Podcast. I'm Gerard Leveque.
And I'm Natasha Foote.
And here's your weekly update on all things agriculture and food in the EU from EURACTIV's Agrifood team.
This week, pesticides, reactions to the fertilisers communication, and avian flu.
And welcome back to another episode of the Agrifood Brief.
You're with the OGs this week.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. And what are we going to talk about?
All kinds of things happened last week. There's been a whole host of things. Wow. But let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start, if anyone gets that reference. So we had the Agri-Fish Council last week on Monday, and there were quite a few different topics that were discussed there.
The Agri-Fish Council. What's this thing?
I know, how jargony, it's terrible. It was the meeting of EU agricultural ministers. There we go.
Wow.
Better? Maybe not.
Technically, if I may, agriculture and fisheries minister.
Oh, sorry. Agri-fish.
Otherwise, it's an agriculture count.
Okay, fine. I'll allow that. And so what were the agriculture and fisheries ministers discussing?
Oh, to be fair, there was a lot to discuss about fisheries too. There was
And it's your favourite topic, huh? Fortuna.
No, it's not my favorite. It's not my favorite. Now our listener thinks that I have so many favorite topics, but it's just that the fisheries is a very interesting sector. And a topic for to cover at EU level, because there's also the competence and so on. But for instance, there was an interesting debate in which the Commission announced that they're gonna present this decarbonization of the fisheries plan, for instance, on fisheries. And at the same time, and I strongly suggest the article that our colleague Hugo wrote about it. It's on EURACTIV if you want to learn more about it started on the 7th of November, the consultation phase, so they just started. But there was also the presentation of the algae strategy.
Hey.
Yeah, by Commissioner Sinkevicius, and I suggest for our listener to read the story from our colleague Ghidre, who interviewed Virginijus Sinkevicius, so two compatriots basically, because they're both Lithuanian.
Algae was a challenge for me to pun about. It took me a long time to figure out.
Yeah. And to be fair, algae has huge potential, not only to improve European diets, because it can be used as food supplements. On my desk in EURACTIV's newsroom, it's true. There's some algae.
It's been there for a long time. I think you need to eat it now.
Yeah.
To commemorate the.
You can do. I mean, you can basically. There's the recipe to do a margarita, the cocktail.
Oh.
With this as a food supplement. But they also contribute to the CO2 mitigation. Because again, it's a very interesting topic.
They're also used as a biostimulant.
Indeed.
As a fertilizers replacement, which leads us on very nicely to our next topic. Who I did there?
You're very good.
I know, not my first time.
Very good, and also I can understand how bored you were by this discussion. Not true. Fertilizer. Indeed. Yeah. There was communication by the Commission 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And
a lifetime ago.
Yeah, and it was the first time in which the minister could actually had a say on what the Commission put together. And it doesn't seem they were super happy.
No way.
No, I mean, they were happy overall, but the biggest issue with the entire fertilizer communication is that basically there's no money.
There's always the issue, no? Show me the money. Where's the money?
There's no money or short-term measures, because in the end it was a bit of a collection of all the things that they've done, and they already announced that they would have done in the next months, in the coming months.
It was the same, they're echoing the same concerns from the farmers, right? That it was all focused on medium and long-term measures, and there was not much on short-term measures. And farmers are facing an imminent spring season. But the main contentious issue though was around this idea of state aid. right?
Yeah, indeed. It was this debate around how to fund this additional money, because we know that the Common Agricultural Policy, so the EU's farming subsidy scheme, has already been at least the allocation for the 2023 for next year. They were already discussed, the national strategic plans and so on. We kind of covered this quite extensively. And there's everything on our website on the CAP tracker. You can check the current status of all of the national strategic plans. So very good resource. But again, the point is that there's no additional money. The CAP effectiveness is a bit undermined by the inflation cost as well. So in a sense, there are some ministers that are actually pushing for triggering once again the crisis reserve fund. So a solution that is included in the EU budget, because there's an amount of money which is 450 million, I think, per year, that it's devoted to a specific crisis situation, and the Commission can allow this money to go into the pockets of basically the struggling sector, in this case farmers. It was triggered for the first time.
It was, yeah,
last year.
And in a conversation that I had with Commissioner Wojciechowski, he was saying that it's very likely that it will be triggered again next year as well.
And during
because we're just kind of in this perma crisis.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And in the press conference, Wojciechowski, after having debated with minister, he wasn't that sure. He was like, no, at the moment it's not actually likely. To be fair, last year it was still this year. It's still linked to direct payments. So basically our farmers are paying for this fund.
It's basically borrowing from the future.
Basically.
It's essentially like, we've got this money, but we're going to take it off of your future payments to have it now. Yeah.
Now it's with the new CAP starting from next year, there's not this link, in the sense that it's not that immediate, like it's the last resort. It doesn't mean that the EU at the moment is struggling in finding other sources for this kind of package. So it's not entirely sure that they're not going to use this direct payment anymore. That's why and it was also included in the fertilizer communication, the easiest way to support farmers is actually state aid. So public money. So not the EU budget, but member state budget. That, as you probably know, if you're a listener of this podcast, state aids are illegal in the EU because we are a single market, and of course you create an imbalance because there are countries that could afford to spend money from their budget, and others that they can't. They recently, we also discussed about this in some previous episode of this podcast, the Commission decided to increase the ceiling for the state aid that are allowed in the EU. So it's a huge amount of money now. It's basically... It's
250,000 euros, right?
Per farm, per farm. So it's a lot.
Fair whack of money, yeah.
And of course, ministers had this exchange of views on whether to use. Of course, certain countries like Germany were more in favor of spending national budget to rescue farmers, while others like Ireland, Portugal, Poland, Spain too, they said that this state aid tool should be the exception and not the norm. So there wasn't they didn't agree on how to on additional funding at the moment. So we expect this topic to be to be raised again in the next Agrifish Council.
And talking about things that are spoken about again and again, in the Agri-Fish Council meeting, there was also this discussion over the Commission's plans to slash the use and risk of pesticides in half by 2030, which was this ambition that was put in the EU's flagship food policy, Farm to Fork strategy. And member states are not very happy about how this has gone down. Basically, we've spoken about it a number of times. We've also written about it. You can check out our articles on EURACTIV. But essentially, member states are saying that, with the situation with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with the fact that it's upended global food supply chains, they're saying that we need to relook at this idea of how we're going to do this. They're saying we need a deeper and more thorough, more comprehensive impact assessment. And so ministers asked for this at the council meeting last week. And in response, the commissioner was talking about, he was saying he knows that it's a very difficult problem to solve. He actually called it a difficult and open problem.
What a word. What a choice of word. Open.
Which does make it sound like they're kind of open. It's still an open discussion. I mean, of course, we had the proposal from the Commission, and of course, there is an element of openness, right? But still, sounds like there's some wiggle room. That's how I interpreted the word open.
Yeah, that's... No, it's interesting. Again, of course, it's open also because lawmakers
of course
have to. But
it's technically open, but yeah.
Still, because to be fair, the requests from, let's say, a certain part of the political spectrum, let's say center-right, but even the right groups in the European Parliament, they're actually saying, like, the Commission should be aware that they don't have a majority anymore in the Council, so with the ministers, but even in the Parliament, according to them. So they should actually think about to change again. This impact assessment, it's that Natasha was mentioning before. It's a bit on this line. To be fair, this is a bit of the trivia moment of Europe. To be fair, Wojciechowski spoke at the Agrifood Council, but the commissioner who's tasked with the pesticide dossier is actually, I wait for 5 seconds just to give the listener the time to...
Am I supposed to say, or is
No, but you know it. It's for our listeners. This is the trivia. Who's the commissioner tasked with the pesticide?
And then we can have a little sound effect.
Stella Kyriakides, the food safety commissioner. The food safety commissioner is, and so DG Sante, the food safety service of the European Commission. And we also had another exclusive, we might say, because...
I see what you did. Yeah. Oh,
I'm good too.
Segues are good today.
I know.
Gosh, it's almost like we planned it.
I'm wondering what will be the segue for the next topic.
Yeah, that one's going to be more of a challenge. I'll think about it. Okay.
Yeah. And because Stella Kyriakides replied to a letter that the Commission received, I think, last month, that was sent by part of the Agriculture Committee, the European Parliament Agriculture Committee, because some groups didn't really agree on the text of the letter, and basically the MEPs were backing a bit the stance of the minister. So we need an impact assessment after Russia invaded Ukraine. So we need for a deeper look at the impact of this major event, this major global event in the global food supply chain. And basically the interesting part of this letter is that in order to appease the critics of his proposal, the commissioner kind of suggested that the EU executive actually hopes, put on the table of the SUR, of the Pesticide Directive, Also, a potential liberalization of the highly controversial gene editing or new genomic techniques.
The old stick and carrot approach.
Yeah, because
so you've got the stick of the pesticide reduction plans, but they're dangling a little carrot in front of the, the centre right and the appease.
Indeed, this is already the segue, no?
No, it could have been.
No,
don't worry.
Could have been.
We've got something even better up my sleeve.
Okay, perfect. Because it's might be a coincidence, but actually the harshest critics of the pesticide reduction proposal are actually the biggest proposers of a deregulation of gene editing, new genomic techniques. So it sounds a bit...
Sounds like a bit of a trade,
Yeah. And
like,
also,
listen, you give me this, I give you that.
Indeed. Because they basically, Kyriakides basically said, I should also like to underline, I'm quoting her here, that the SUR proposal is not an isolated measure. And she mentioned funds from Horizon Europe, so basically innovation, but also the forthcoming initiative that is supposed it's penciled Q2 of 2022. So it's basically the second quarter. Again, it's a bit of a coincidence, but of course, Green MEP. We spoke in this article that was published on EURACTIV last week. We spoke with Tilly Metz, Green MEP, and she basically. Realized that something...
she wasn't very happy, was she?
Yeah. And now, basically, we're going to see how it's going, this dossier, because it was technically scheduled finally scheduled in the European Parliament. So the ENVI committee and also the Agri committee, they share the competence on certain aspects of the regulation. They're going to start discussing, they're going to approve a mandate in order to find a compromise with the other side, with the other lawmakers, so the minister.
So today we're taking a deep dive into avian influenza. Now, the EU's neighbour, the UK, is currently facing one of the worst outbreaks of avian influenza ever, so much so that the country is seeing shortages of both poultry meat and eggs in the run-up to Christmas. But is the EU faring much better? Well, we spoke to a few experts to see what the situation is. And now let's start at the beginning. First things first, what exactly is avian influenza?
Avian influenza is a highly contagious viral disease which mainly occurs in poultry and wild water birds.
That's Francesca Baldinelli. She is a veterinary epidemiologist and scientific officer at the European Food Safety Agency, EFSA, where she's been working on avian influenza since 2017.
Avian influenza viruses can be either low or high pathogenic viruses, depending on their molecular characteristics and on their ability to cause disease and death, mortality in chicken. Poultry infected with low pathogenic avian influenza viruses can show mild signs or not show clinical signs at all, whereas infection caused by highly pathogenic avian influenza cause usually death of the animals. And that's why this is an issue for the poultry sector, because the virus is spread really rapidly. So when it's present in an area, in a farm, it quickly spread within all animals, all the farms, and also outside the farms, causing really production losses to the industry.
So how bad really is the current situation in the EU?
Yeah, to understand the current situation, I think we need to also have a little bit of understanding of what before of what we are facing now. So since 2005, multiple incursions of highly pathogenic avian influenza have occurred through migratory water birds coming to Europe to winter. And the impact of those epidemics had been variables depending on the different years. But what we are now facing is really the worst avian influenza epidemic season ever. And that because since October last year, we have observed the largest number of outbreaks in poultry, in wild birds, and also a huge number of wild bird species affected. And the geographical extent of this epidemic is also very wide.
The UK is just next door, and you said that this disease is spread by wild birds. So is this something that could have knock-on impacts in the EU?
What I can see from a scientific point of view is that, we are within Europe from a geographical point of view, but the connection with UK is is mainly based on the direction of the migration of the wild water birds. That is usually in a westward direction. So it's coming toward the west than toward the east. This is what I can see. And on the other hand, UK is facing the worst ever epidemic, but it's the same in the Union. So I don't see. The situation are quite similar, I would say.
So what about the industry perspective in all of this? Well, we spoke with Gerard Leveque, who works for the European Poultry breeders, and also Paul Henri from AVEC, and that's the voice of Europe's poultry meat sector, to learn more.
As an industry, we are concerned because, as I said, there is a huge impact on mortality. And it is at this moment unpredictable where will be the next outbreak. And we find it very difficult to find solutions through biosecurity to guarantee that a flock will not be contaminated.
So UK producers have now had to move their birds inside in the most affected areas, and they've implemented strict biosecurity measures. Can you talk a little bit about the burden and the cost that this causes for producers and the impact this could have on production, especially, for example, free-range producers?
So one thing about the impact on free-range production, just to explain that there have been some provisions in the legislation to make sure that although the free-range producer will have to take their birds inside, they will still be able to market their products as free-range. So the economic impact for them will be reduced or non-existing because of these provisions in the legislation. So that's a positive thing for them, and that's positive also for biosecurity in this fight against avian influenza.
So what funding is available to help EU producers deal with avian flu? Is there enough funding available?
The compensations are provided both by the EU funds, EU Commission, and on the other side by the member states, and the rate depends between the member states. And it's important to understand that those compensations are very important. First, to ensure the well-being of the farmers, because obviously they are not responsible when they have a case, if they have taken all the good biosecurity measures that can happen to anyone. And the second element is that the public has to understand that it's very important to ensure that the farmer will be compensated, because then, if not, and if they have to assume the financial risk, then there is a risk that they may not say that they have an outbreak, and that it will contribute to more dissemination of the outbreak. So it's very important to support the farmers and the players on the ground to make sure they take all the measures, and that each time we have an outbreak, it's noticed to the authorities, and that we take the right measures. So those compensations are extremely important to fight the outbreak.
Now, back in May of this year, EU agricultural ministers agreed to implement a bird flu vaccine strategy. So what's the latest on this? Is this moving fast enough in your opinion?
The decision from EU has been to give the possibility to move to vaccination. So first, we are waiting new regulation. It will come soon. But then when you have the regulation, you also need to define the strategy, and you also need to get the good vaccines. And this point is difficult. First, because when you speak about birds, it is different species, and each species can react differently to the vaccines. and it takes time because we need, as much as possible, we need to reduce the mortality, but we need also to reduce the spread from one bird to the other, from one farm to the other. So that's a difficulty. And the second difficulty when you define a strategy is that obviously from one year to the other, the behavior of the virus is changing.
And that's all from us this week. This week, the Agrifood Podcast is produced by EURACTIV's Agrifood team, Gerard Leveque, Natasha Food, and Paola Andres, with the technical support of AVEC. And this podcast is also available on all major streaming platforms, including Apple, Amazon, Stitcher, and Spotify.
Be sure to subscribe to our Agrifood Brief so you don't miss the latest news in the EU. I'm Natasha Foot. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.